The barn had always been my refuge from solitude, but one night, a simple interaction with our horse took an unexpected turn, leaving me questioning everything I believed about trust, boundaries, and my own desires. I know it sounds unusual, but it began innocently. Or at least that's what I told myself initially. My husband was away on yet another business trip, and the house felt too silent, too hollow. Seeking solace, I wandered out to the barn, as I had done countless times before. Apollo, our stunning chestnut gelding, had always been a soothing presence, a source of calm in my otherwise predictable life. But that evening, something felt different, a shift I couldn't quite define. In the stillness of the barn, I crossed a line I never imagined I would, one that blurred the boundaries of trust, loyalty, and my own sense of self. My husband and I had built a life of routine, predictability, and comfort. He worked long hours in his corporate job, often traveling for business while I stayed home. Our days were filled with ordinary moments, quiet dinners, uneventful weekends, and evenings spent in front of the TV. Yet, beneath the surface, something was missing. It wasn't something I could immediately identify, but over time, the gap between us seemed to widen. That's when I turned to our horse. We had always owned horses on our property, a piece of land far from the city's chaos, a place where we could breathe. The barn was well maintained and the fields stretched out like a serene oasis. My husband loved the horses, and I could see they brought him peace, but for him, they were little more than a pastime. For me, however, they represented a deeper connection, a way to escape the monotony of my daily life. I often visited the barn, fed the horses, and enjoyed their company when my husband was away. That's how it began, the relationship I never anticipated. I remember the first time I entered the barn alone while my husband was away on one of his trips. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of hay and earth. Standing in the stall was Apollo, a large, beautiful gelding with a glossy chestnut coat that shimmered in the sunlight streaming through the barn windows. His deep, soulful brown eyes seemed to watch me with curiosity. I had never been particularly close to him before. He was always my husband's horse. But that day, I felt an inexplicable pull toward him, an unexpected bond. I hesitated for a moment, standing by the stall door, simply observing him. He lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air around me. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped closer. "Hey there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The words felt odd, but there was something about him that made me want to speak as if he could understand. For reasons I couldn't explain, I sensed an immediate trust from him. Apollo seemed to recognize my vulnerability, just as I recognized his. In the days that followed, I began spending more time in the barn. Whenever my husband was away, I would visit Apollo, brushing his coat, cleaning his hooves, or simply sitting beside him in the quiet. I couldn't explain why, but being with him brought me a sense of peace, an emotional release I had been craving. As time passed, my husband's trips grew longer, and I found myself becoming more attached to Apollo. It was as if he understood my unspoken feelings. His presence comforted me, and when I rode him, it felt like escaping into a world where nothing else mattered. The rhythmic motion of his gallop became my solace, the wind in my hair, the sound of hooves beneath me. It was an experience unlike anything I had ever known. But then, one day, something changed. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a quiet moment in the barn. I had spent the afternoon riding, and as I returned to untack him, an urge to stay washed over me. I didn't want to leave. I couldn't explain it. But there was a strange longing I couldn't ignore. As I ran my hands over Apollo's sleek coat, I felt a surge of warmth, something beyond the simple connection we had built. Without thinking, I moved closer, my hands lingering longer than usual. He didn't pull away. In fact, he seemed to lean into my touch, his body responding in a way I hadn't expected. It was subtle at first. A nudge, a shift in position. But I felt it. The energy between us, a silent understanding. That's when I knew. I realize how strange it sounds, how impossible it must seem to anyone who hasn't experienced it. But I could feel Apollo's presence in every part of me. It was as if he had become an extension of myself, our thoughts intertwining in some inexplicable way. It wasn't about desire, not at first, but there was a tension, an undeniable charge that lingered whenever we were together. I tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but it was always there. Every time my husband was gone, I found myself drawn back to the barn, drawn to Apollo. The nights alone in the house grew colder, emptier. I would sit in the silence, listening to the wind outside, waiting for my husband to return. But even when he was home, the distance between us seemed to grow. I couldn't talk to him the way I could talk to Apollo. He didn't understand my silences, my needs. But Apollo, he understood without a single word. One night, after a particularly long day, I found myself in the barn again, unable to resist the pull. I had tried to ignore it, to focus on other things, but the ache in my chest became unbearable. Apollo was waiting for me. I went directly to him without hesitation, without a second thought. The barn was dim, illuminated only by the faint moonlight seeping through the gaps in the walls. Apollo stood there, calm and patient, as if he had been anticipating my arrival all along. I could feel his steady gaze on me, and for a moment I simply stood there, inhaling the cool night air, trying to steady my racing heart. Then it happened. I can't pinpoint exactly what triggered it, but as I reached out to touch Apollo's mane, something shifted between us. The bond we shared was no longer just emotional. It had deepened into something more profound. Suddenly, I realized I had crossed a line. I stepped back, my heart pounding. What was I doing? What had I just done? But the truth was, I didn't want to stop. I wasn't sure why, but in that moment, I couldn't deny that Apollo and I shared something inexplicable, something that had taken root within me and was impossible to ignore. It didn't end there. This wasn't a fleeting moment. It was the start of something I couldn't escape, something that grew stronger with each passing day. As my husband continued to be away on business trips, I found myself returning to the barn again and again. I didn't know how to define it. All I knew was that I couldn't stay away. But this wasn't the end of the story. The first time I crossed that line, I thought it was a mistake. A one-time lapse I would regret and bury deep inside, hoping no one would ever discover. I tried to convince myself that I was simply confused, that the loneliness in my life had clouded my judgment. But that was the issue. It wasn't a mistake, nor was it confusion. It was a need. A deep, primal need that intensified with every visit to the barn. Apollo was no longer just a horse. He had become my secret, my escape, my obsession. His presence lingered in my mind even when I wasn't with him. During quiet moments at home, I would think of him. The way his coat shimmered in the sunlight, how his muscles moved beneath his skin. I could almost feel his warmth, the way he responded to me. The connection between us was undeniable, like a magnetic force pulling me toward him no matter how hard I tried to resist. It wasn't just the physical closeness that drew me in. It was the silence, the unspoken understanding between us that spoke louder than words. Apollo didn't need to say anything to make me feel seen, understood, and desired. He knew. Every touch, every glance we shared sent a wave of heat through my body, and I couldn't stop it. No matter how many times I told myself I was being irrational, that I was just lonely and needed to regain control, I kept returning to the barn. It wasn't even about my husband being gone. Yes, he was frequently away on business, but I still had my own life to live. I could have gone out with friends, focused on hobbies, or even taken up work again. But the truth was, I didn't want anyone else. I didn't want the company of people or to fill the void with something meaningless. I wanted Apollo. That night, after everything had changed between us, I couldn't sleep. My husband had just returned from a week-long trip, and though I was glad to see him, a part of me felt empty. As he lay beside me in bed, his steady breathing only seemed to amplify the turmoil in my mind. I couldn't focus. The memory of Apollo's movements, the warmth of his body, replayed in my head like a loop. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and found myself standing by the window, staring out at the barn in the distance. The moonlight bathed the field in a soft glow, and for a moment I felt torn between the life I had built with my husband and the strange new world I had begun to create with Apollo. I had been back from the barn for hours, but my body still tingled. My skin still hummed with the memory of what had happened. Apollo's presence seemed to linger in the air, the bond between us pulsing with its own rhythm. I tried to push it away, but it wouldn't let go. There was no escaping it now. I returned to bed, moving slowly as if in a trance. I could hear my husband's quiet breathing, his back turned to me, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. The silence between us felt suffocating. I had always believed in the love we shared, but now it felt distant, like something I could no longer reach. The emotional void I had tried to ignore was becoming impossible to overlook. My husband was a good man. He didn't deserve this, but at that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. The next day, I waited for the right opportunity. My husband had plans to meet with a colleague, leaving me alone again with only the sounds of the house and the fields outside for company. I didn't know what drove me to it. Perhaps it was the way Apollo's gaze seemed to burn into me whenever I was near him. Or maybe it was the irresistible pull of a desire I'd been trying to suppress for so long. But I didn't hesitate. As soon as I knew my husband was gone, I made my way to the barn. I moved quickly, as if some part of me knew that if I slowed down, I might stop. And I couldn't stop. Not now. I found Apollo waiting for me, just as he always did. His coat was sleek, his muscles shifting beneath his skin as he turned toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I could see the same longing in them that I felt in my chest. I didn't say anything. Words no longer seemed necessary. I walked toward him, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. My hands trembled as I reached for him, and when I touched his mane, a jolt of electricity shot through me. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though every nerve in my body was alive, every part of me attuned to him. He nickered softly, as if inviting me closer, and I didn't hesitate. My hands roamed over his coat. The heat from his body spread through my fingers, my skin tingling with feeling. The world beyond the barn faded into the background as I focused entirely on him. I didn't understand what overtook me, but I didn't resist. I couldn't. The barn lay quiet except for Apollo's steady breaths and the faint rustle of his mane beneath my touch. The tension between us became heavy and undeniable. I edged closer, leaning into his side, the heat he emitted soaking into me. Pulling away was impossible. I didn't want to. Apollo turned his head, brushing his muzzle against my neck, his breath warming my skin. A rush of heat surged through me, and I gasped, startled by the intensity. Instinctively, I lifted my hand to his face, fingertips brushing his lips. Then it happened. Apollo leaned in, nostrils flaring, and I swore our heartbeats synced. Time froze. The world outside vanished. I don't recall how the boundary dissolved, but suddenly I wasn't just standing there. My body pressed against his, hands roaming without conscious thought. The feel of his muscles under my palms stole my breath. I was powerless, swept into a whirlwind of raw need I couldn't name. There was no retreat. As abruptly as it began, awareness crashed over me. My chest heaved, breaths harsh in the barn's stillness. Apollo's warmth enveloped the space, leaving me raw and exposed. I staggered back, trembling, heart racing. One truth burned clear. There was no undoing this. The line I'd crossed wasn't just physical. It had rewritten my heart and mind, leaving me adrift. The memory haunted me, how my body reacted to him, how his presence overwhelmed my senses. I tried dismissing it as momentary madness, but the bond only tightened. Ignoring it fueled its grip. My husband left again, leaving me alone with Apollo and my fractured thoughts. Even when home, I was absent, consumed by the barn, his heat, the indescribable awakening he sparked. Days blurred. Every moment apart became agony. I craved his breath on my skin, the press of his body against mine. I visited daily, inventing excuses, fresh air, a walk, solitude, to hide the truth. I needed Apollo more than air itself. An invisible force now bound us. The barn became our universe, shutting out life's clamor. But this time, the barn felt altered. Apollo wasn't in his usual stall, eyes soft with waiting. I called his name, voice trembling. Silence. Panic clawed my throat. I darted through stalls until his familiar whinny echoed. He stood at the stable's far end, head bowed. Spotting me, he trotted over, hooves rhythmic on the floor. I froze, watching him approach. He nudged me gently, as if to soothe. My hands shook as I touched his mane, his warmth seeping into me. Eyes closed, I let the moment settle. Yet something stirred again. A quiet hunger I couldn't suppress. My breath hitched as I stroked his neck, muscles shifting under my fingers. The closeness was electric, the air dense with unspoken truths. The gap between us narrowed, as if we merged beyond flesh. Words failed. Our bond transcended explanation, emotions and motions intertwined. He mirrored my thoughts. I mirrored his breaths. A silent dialogue deepened with each second. I edged nearer, hand gliding down his side, my body melting into his. Doubts dissolved in his heat. Words were pointless. There was only us, a tether of silence, relentless and unyielding. Long ago, I'd stopped asking why. Understanding no longer mattered. Apollo shifted, positioning himself so his chest gently pressed against mine, and a surge of emotion washed over me. His breath warmed my skin, and I closed my eyes, letting the sensations ripple through me. My hands glided over his coat, the smooth muscles beneath sending waves of warmth through my body. My heartbeat quickened, the tension between us mounting with every passing second. I had never felt so alive. It wasn't just the physical closeness, though that was undeniable. It was the emotional depth, the sense that I had discovered something beyond the ordinary. Apollo was no longer just an animal to me. He was my equal. He understood me in ways no one else could, and in turn, I understood him in ways no one else ever would. His gaze locked with mine again, and an electric current passed between us, deepening our connection in a way that was almost frightening. I could feel his warmth, his energy, his life force, as if we had merged for a moment. I was no longer just myself. I was part of something greater. Instinctively, I reached for his mane, drawing him closer. His body responded, pressing against mine with a gentle force that made my heart race. Every inch of him seemed to burn with an intensity that mirrored my own desire. He wasn't just beside me. He was part of me, and I was part of him. The pull was undeniable. The tension that had been quietly building between us over the past weeks had finally reached its peak. But just as the intensity flared, something inside me recoiled. I stood there, trembling, my breath shallow as the weight of what I was doing hit me. Guilt crashed over me like a cold wave, followed by shame. What was I doing? What had I become? I stepped back from Apollo, my heart pounding. I couldn't look at him. The guilt, the fear, the realization that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross overwhelmed me. I stumbled back, wiping my face, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I had no words, no explanation for what was happening between us. Yet, in the silence, Apollo seemed to understand. He didn't move away. Instead, he stood there, watching me with those deep, knowing eyes, as if he could sense the storm raging inside me. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to break free from this strange, twisted bond that had formed between us. And I didn't know how to return to the way things were before. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself I could go back, I knew deep down I wasn't the same person anymore. I had become someone else. Someone who had crossed a line that could never be erased. The most terrifying part? I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. I was spiraling, lost in a world I couldn't navigate. The pull between Apollo and me was undeniable, but it came with a darkness I couldn't escape. It felt like I had willingly stepped into a maze with no exit, no way to undo what I had allowed to happen. The worst part was that every part of me, my body, my mind, my soul, was pulling me deeper into that maze, deeper into Apollo's orbit. At times, the guilt was overwhelming. But there were moments when Apollo stood close, when he nuzzled my neck or brushed against me with his warm, soft body, that the guilt faded. It seemed insignificant compared to the magnetic force between us. When he was near, I wasn't reminded of the life I had left behind, the promises I had made, or the vows I had taken. With him, everything made sense in a way the outside world never could. There was no noise, no judgment, just us. But the tension was rising. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the growing closeness between Apollo and me. It was the realization that I couldn't keep living in this secret world forever. There were days when I was torn between pretending everything was normal and the urge to abandon that facade entirely. The illusion I had built with my husband was growing more fragile by the day. For a while, I had managed to keep up appearances, lying to myself and to him. When he returned from his trips, I pretended everything was fine. But I knew he had started to notice something. A shift in my eyes, a change he couldn't ignore. I couldn't hide the way my body seemed to hum with energy whenever I was near Apollo, or how I would zone out, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with my husband. One evening, he approached me, his expression serious. He had been quiet for days, watching me from the corner of his eye with a look I couldn't decipher. The unspoken questions hung between us like a thick fog, suffocating everything. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes searching mine. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but laced with an unsettling calm. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to confess everything, the truth I had been hiding, the secret world I had built with Apollo, the way I had betrayed him. But another part of me couldn't bring myself to shatter the illusion. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice sounding distant, even to me. I cursed myself for the way my heart raced, the way my hands trembled slightly. He studied me for a long moment before pushing away from the doorframe. His gaze never left me as he stepped closer, his voice quieter now, tinged with concern. "I've been giving you space because I thought you needed it. But this isn't you. You've been different." I had no answer. I felt like a stranger to myself, detached from the life I once knew. The woman I used to be, the part of me that had been his wife, seemed to have faded, lost in a world that no longer fit. "I've been fine," I finally said, forcing the words out even as they tasted like lies. "Just a little stressed." But he wasn't convinced. He watched me for another moment, then, as if he had made a decision, turned and left the room without a word. The silence that followed was suffocating. I heard him downstairs, pacing the kitchen, and I knew he was trying to figure it out, trying to piece together a puzzle he couldn't solve. I wanted to leave, to escape, to run to the barn and be with Apollo, where nothing mattered but the warmth of his body and the quiet between us. But I couldn't. Not yet. The days grew colder, and I found myself retreating further into my own mind. I stopped pretending. I stopped fighting it. The pull to Apollo was all-consuming now, making it impossible to function without him. Then it happened. It was late afternoon when my husband left for a meeting, and I made my way to the barn once more. I knew what I was doing. I knew the consequences, but there was no turning back. Apollo greeted me as he always did, and I stood there, staring into his deep brown eyes, unable to look away. The connection between us seemed to shimmer in the air. I could feel his energy, his presence, his quiet power surrounding me. I walked toward him, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch his mane. But this time, something was different. This time, there was a certain intensity in the air, a knowing between us that hadn't been there before. As I ran my fingers through his mane, I felt the tension in my body release, a rush of desire washing over me. My mind couldn't process it anymore. The thoughts were too chaotic, the emotions too raw. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Footsteps. My heart stopped, and panic surged through me. I pulled away quickly, my breath coming in short gasps as I glanced around the barn. But it wasn't my husband. It was something else, something that made me freeze in place. Apollo's eyes were wide, his body tense, but the quiet connection between us didn't break. It was as though time had stopped, the world holding its breath. Then I heard it, the creak of the barn door opening, the unmistakable voice of my husband. He was home early. My blood ran cold. I had been caught, not physically, but emotionally. There was no going back from this moment. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. My heart pounded as I heard him approach the barn, each step echoing in my mind like a countdown. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind lies. I could feel the weight of the truth settling around me, the consequences of my actions finally catching up. When my husband stepped into the barn, I didn't look at him. I couldn't. He stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment, and then I heard him speak. "I knew something was wrong," he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't want to believe it, but now I understand. I turned to face him, my heart heavy with shame. The man I had promised myself to, the man I had once loved with everything I had, was standing there, and I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. "I never wanted this," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. But it happened. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pain in his eyes told me everything. There was no easy way to fix what had been broken, no way to erase what had happened between Apollo and me. The story had reached its tragic, irreversible end, and there was no undoing the damage I had caused. My world had shifted, twisted and broken in ways I couldn't comprehend. And in that moment, as the silence between us stretched, I realized that no matter what came next, there was no going back to what I had once known. Everything had changed.